Picture this. It's 1963. You walk into Fort Knox,
Right.
the most secure vault on Earth, the literal bedrock of American wealth. And over half of the gold sitting right in front of you came from African shores.
Over 52% to be exact.
Exactly. At that exact moment in history, Africa was providing over 60% of the world's gold. It held a massive share of the globe's uranium, copper, and iron.
And let's not forget the water power.
Right. An astonishing 42% of the world's potential hydroelectric power. But here is the paradox we are unpacking today. The continent that was practically bankrolling the global economy was struggling to secure its own basic economic survival.
So welcome to the deep dive. We are thrilled to have you with us today.
It really is a staggering paradox. And that very contradiction, the wealth of the land versus the condition of the people, that sits right at the heart of the text we're examining.
It absolutely does. For this deep dive, we're taking you through a comprehensive academic analysis of one of the most pivotal speeches of the 20th century.
Delivered by Kwame Nkrumah. Yes, on May 24th, 1963, he was speaking to the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. Our mission today is to unpack this foundational document. We're going to examine the historical context, the political ideology he championed, his rhetorical strategies, and importantly,
The contradictions.
right, the stark contradictions between his grand continental vision and his eventual political reality.
When you read the source text, you realize it operates as a masterclass in anti-colonial rhetoric and in socialist economic planning, too. It's widely considered the foundational blueprint for Pan-Africanism.
I mean, in a single address, Nkrumah diagnoses the mechanisms of global economic exploitation and then just prescribes this highly specific unified structural solution.
But to really grasp the weight of these words, we first need to set the scene for you, because the text highlights a remarkably rapid pace of decolonization.
Right, the timeline is incredible.
It is. Nkrumah points out that just 5 years prior to this 1963 gathering, there were only 8 independent African states. Just 8. And by the time he steps up to the podium in Addis Ababa, hosted by His Imperial Majesty, Haile Selassie, he's looking out at the representatives of 32 sovereign states.
What's fascinating here is that exponential increase. Going from 8 to 32 independent nations in half a decade is what Nkrumah describes as the revolutionary speed of world events.
And the man delivering this address was inextricably linked to that momentum. If we look at the biographical context in our source, Kwame Nkrumah was born in the British colony of the Gold Coast.
He traveled to the United States to study, right?
Yes, at the historically black Lincoln College. That is where he connected deeply with African-American intellectuals. He really immersed himself in their civil rights struggles.
And he takes that framework of systemic struggle back to his homeland. In 1949, he helps found the Convention People's Party. And his platform wasn't about asking politely for gradual changes.
Not at all.
He demanded immediate home rule from the British Commonwealth. He went through the crucible of imprisonment and harassment by colonial authorities. But by 1960, he emerged as the first elected head of state of the newly independent Ghana.
So when he speaks to this room in 1963, he isn't just a theorist. He speaks with the authority of someone who personally navigated that transition from colonial subject to head of state.
Which brings us to a crucial piece of our analysis, his intended audience. He opens his address to his excellencies, colleagues, brothers, and friends.
The newly minted leaders of those 32 sovereign states.
Exactly. These are individuals who have just won their national independence, often after grueling, bloody struggles. And yet Nkrumah stands before them and explicitly challenges them to surrender a portion of that hard-fought individual sovereignty
In favor of a collective continental government.
But wait, let me play devil's advocate here. He's standing in front of 32 leaders who just shed blood for their own national flags, and he's telling them to give up that sovereignty immediately.
He is.
Didn't that sound completely radical to them? I mean, it's like finally paying off your mortgage after a grueling 30 years, and the very next day someone asks you to sign your house over to a giant neighborhood trust.
That is a very apt analogy. It was incredibly radical, and you've hit on exactly why it was such a difficult pitch for him to make. But this leads right into the core of his political ideology, which is a concept we can call the political kingdom.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Nkrumah makes a definitive argument that economic independence can only follow political unity. He tells them that the social and economic development of Africa will come only within the political kingdom, not the other way around.
Why couldn't they just focus on building up their own individual economies first? I think that's what a lot of them wanted to do.
Because Nkrumah firmly rejected the idea that smaller nations could build strong independent economies while remaining politically fractured. To support his argument, he draws historical parallels in the text.
He points to the U.S. and the USSR.
Precisely. He notes that both of these superpowers were the results of political decisions of revolutionary peoples. They unified politically before they evolved into mighty realities of social power and material wealth.
So he argues that prioritizing economic development without a unified political shield leaves these new nations completely exposed to what he calls neo-colonialism.
Yes.
Now, for the listener trying to grasp the academic weight of this, how exactly does the text define neo-colonialism? It's not just a political buzzword here.
No, it's a very specific mechanism.
Yeah.
He defines neo-colonialism as an ongoing, ruthless iteration of imperialism. It is the insidious control of African economies and domestic affairs by foreign agencies and markets, operating even after a nation has achieved formal, on-paper political independence.
So the flag changes, but the bank accounts don't.
Exactly. He warns the room that imperialism has actually grown stronger and more dangerous in its international associations. If these 32 nations remain politically fractured, they don't become 32 strong economies. They simply become a stable, fractured field for foreign extraction.
And this demand for political unity intersects deeply with the geopolitics of the time. Remember, it's 1963.
The Cold War is raging.
Right, and Nkrumah is absolutely militant about non-alignment, which basically meant telling both the U.S. and the Soviets to keep their proxy wars out of Africa.
He explicitly demands that Africa be declared a nuclear-free zone and freed from Cold War exigencies. He also points out a very uncomfortable truth to his audience. Many independent African states had already become involved in military pacts with former colonial powers.
He argues that the security those pacts supposedly offer is entirely illusory. In reality, these foreign military bases just entrench neo-colonial controls. They act as centers of tension that threaten neighboring states.
So he's diagnosed the disease, this insidious neo-colonialism, and these dangerous foreign military pacts. But how does he convince a room full of proud, newly independent leaders to take his medicine?
Let's look at his rhetorical strategy. He builds momentum throughout the speech using stark binaries, the most famous being his urgent warning that Africa must unite or sink.
It's a rhetoric of ultimate stakes. He warns that without unity, they will sink into the condition of Latin America. The text quotes him describing Latin America as the unwilling and distressed prey of imperialism after 1.5 centuries of political independence.
In other words, he's pointing at Latin America and saying, look, they've been politically independent for 150 years, but foreign powers still dictate their resources. We cannot let that happen to us.
And to drive that point home, he weaponizes economic data. It is mathematically staggering. He sets out to prove that Africa has been the milk cow of the Western world.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, his strategy relies heavily on evoking a profound sense of exploitation.
The figures he cites are meticulously chosen to shock his audience. He notes that between 1945 and 1955, Western firms exported $2.773 billion worth of goods from the Congo alone.
Let's just pause on that number for a second. Nearly $3 billion extracted from just the Congo in the 1950s.
It's astronomical.
To put that into perspective for you, that wasn't just corporate profit. That was the wholesale extraction of a nation's future.
Precisely. And he doesn't stop there. He notes that between 1947 and 1951, Western gold mining companies drew a profit of $814 million from South Africa.
He contrasts that staggering outward flow of wealth with the domestic poverty of the continent.
He points out to the leaders that all the stock exchanges in the world are preoccupied with Africa's gold, diamonds, uranium, and copper. Yet the continent itself is constantly told it lacks capital and industrial skill.
He's using these numbers to prove that the capital already exists. It's just flowing out in streams to irrigate Western economies instead of being retained for African development.
For those of you analyzing this text for a class or research project, there are several key quotes that perfectly distill Nkrumah's rhetorical approach.
One foundational citation is his assertion that, quote, independence is only the prelude to a new and more involved struggle for the right to conduct our own economic and social affairs.
Another critical quote that really highlights his critique of the leadership sitting right in front of him is this, quote, "We have been too busy nursing our separate states to understand fully the basic need of our union, rooted in common purpose, common planning, and common endeavor."
He is actively indicting their focus on individual nationalism over continental solidarity.
He is. So he has diagnosed the disease, and he's laid out the stakes using undeniable math. But what was his actual prescription? How did he expect to fix it?
Nkrumah doesn't just offer philosophical critiques. He ends his speech with a list of highly specific, immediate actions to force the continent's hand toward total union. He proposes the immediate establishment of an All-Africa Committee of Foreign Ministers.
And he also outlines a unified economic structure. He demands a unified monetary zone, suggesting a common parity for currencies.
To prove his commitment, he notes that his own country of Ghana would change to a decimal system to align with this vision.
Furthermore, he pushes for an African central bank. He argues that an independent currency is mandatory for independent financing. He astutely points out that a currency system backed by a foreign state is inherently subject to the trade and financial arrangements of that foreign country.
And to replace those foreign military pacts we discussed earlier, he proposes a unified defense system, an African high command to ensure continental stability and security.
It is a massive, comprehensive blueprint for immediate structural integration.
However, this is where we have to examine the objective historical contradictions provided in our source text.
Right, because there is a profound dissonance between the soaring rhetoric of his continental vision and the grim reality of his own domestic policies.
He spoke brilliantly of massive, unified continental industrialization, of escaping the grip of foreign markets. Yet his administration in Ghana failed to weather those exact economic storms.
The source material lays this out clearly. Nkrumah attempted to place his homeland on a path to rapid industrial development. Unfortunately, this led to ballooning national debt.
And this debt was then compounded by a plummeting market for cocoa, which was Ghana's largest export.
For those who might not be economists, a cash crop economy means your entire nation's wealth is tied to the global price of one or two raw materials.
If the world suddenly decides they won't pay top dollar for your cocoa, your entire national budget collapses.
And that caused severe economic stagnation and popular dissatisfaction in Ghana. The tragic irony is striking when you look back at the text of his speech.
Because in 1963, he explicitly warned the OAU about this. He said, "What use to the farmer is education and mechanization unless we can ensure for them a fair price and ready market."
He literally warned them against leaving the peasantry to the mercy of foreign cash crop markets. Yet, it was the collapse of a foreign cash crop market cocoa that critically destabilized his own government.
Ultimately, Nkrumah was deposed by a military coup d'etat in 1966, just 3 years later.
He lived the remainder of his life in exile in neighboring Guinea. It is a stark, sobering contrast to the invincible unity he preached.
So, what does this all mean? Why should you, listening today, care about a speech delivered in 1963 by a leader whose own domestic agenda ultimately collapsed?
You should care because this text acts as a remarkably accurate diagnostic tool for understanding long-term regional and geopolitical challenges.
Nkrumah's speech is filled with prophetic warnings. They predicted the exact fracture points of the continent's geopolitical landscape.
For instance, he explicitly identified arbitrary borders as a fatal relic of colonialism. He warned his peers that unless they succeeded in rendering these existing boundaries obsolete through a true political union, those borders would inevitably drive adjacent neighbors to war against one another.
And looking at the geopolitical map of the continent over the decades that followed, that wasn't just a warning, that was practically a prophecy.
It was. Now, let's talk about the alternative view at that conference, because Nkrumah was deeply opposed to what he called the gradual approach to unity.
There were leaders in that room who suggested taking things piecemeal. Their argument was essentially, let's fix our own houses first. Treat the continent as a static entity, eliminate problems one by one, and then eventually we'll unite.
Nkrumah believed that view was fundamentally flawed because it ignored external pressures. The world wasn't going to wait for them to get organized. He warned that any delay, any gradualism, would simply allow neo-colonialism to consolidate its position.
He argued that the cost of inaction, the cost of remaining divided into 32 separate entities, was permanent dependence on bilateral aid.
He pointed out that an Africa of 300 million people bargaining as a single united entity would not be dependent on restricted sources for aid or trade. They would have the entire world to choose from.
To summarize our analysis for you, Kwame Nkrumah's 1963 speech in Addis Ababa was an urgent, mathematically backed, and rhetorically brilliant plea for Pan-African unification.
It correctly diagnosed the incoming threats of neo-colonialism and the severe dangers of economic dependency. This holds true even if Nkrumah himself could not ultimately outrun the unforgiving economic realities of the global market in his own country.
Which brings us to a final thought for you to ponder long after this deep dive ends. Toward the conclusion of his speech, Nkrumah asks his peers a very pointed question.
He asks if they truly wanted to model their association on organizations where weaker states are left at the mercy of stronger ones, or at the mercy of outside nations dictating the flow of trade.
He warned that without total political union, the leaders sitting in that room would eventually become the victims and martyrs of neo-colonialism.
Looking objectively at the historical text and the warnings it contains, you are left to explore on your own. Did the gradual, piecemeal approach that Nkrumah so deeply feared ultimately become the reality?
And did it carry the exact economic and political consequences he predicted that day in 1963? It is a heavy question, but one that requires us to view history not just as a dusty record of the past, but as an ongoing living dialogue with the present. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We encourage you to keep examining the sources, parsing the rhetoric, and questioning the historical blueprints that continue to shape our modern world.